"Sir, you can't cash a check that large looking like that." The words sliced through the quiet hum of the bank lobby, so sharply that even the clicking keyboard seemed to pause. Sunlight poured through the 40-foot glass windows, spilling across polished marble floors and rows of waiting customers. For a moment, nobody moved. Then every head slowly turned toward the man standing at the center of the room. Elijah Brooks remained still. His weathered brown jacket carried faint traces of dust from the road. His work boots were worn at the edges. There was nothing about him that looked wealthy, powerful, or important. At least not to the people staring at him. In front of him stood Gregory Whitman, the branch manager of Whitmore National Bank. His tailored navy suit looked flawless beneath the bright lobby lights. His silver name badge gleamed against his tie. Gregory folded his arms and glanced at the check in his hand again, as if seeing the number written across it offended him personally. A few customers shifted in their seats. Others leaned forward, pretending not to listen while listening to every word. The amount on the check was impossible to ignore. $600,000. Gregory let out a dry laugh. There has to be some mistake. Elijah's expression never changed. There isn't. His voice was calm, steady, the kind of voice that didn't need volume to command attention. Gregory shook his head slowly. You expect me to believe this belongs to you? Elijah looked at him for a second before answering. I expect you to verify it. The response only seemed to irritate Gregory more. He glanced towards several employees standing nearby. A few nervous smiles appeared. One teller looked down at her desk, clearly uncomfortable. Gregory stepped closer to the counter and tapped the check against the polished surface. People don't just walk in off the street and cash checks like this. The air inside the lobby felt heavier now. Elijah could feel dozens of eyes studying him, judging him, measuring his worth before a single fact had been confirmed. Yet he showed no anger, no embarrassment. If anything, he looked strangely patient. Outside, traffic moved along. The avenue beyond the glass walls. Yellow taxis rolled past. A city bus stopped at the corner. Life continued normally, while something inside the bank quietly shifted. Gregory turned toward his employees. You know what the problem is? He said loudly enough for nearby customers to hear. Everybody thinks they can fool the system. A few people chuckled. Elijah remained silent. The branch manager looked back at him and smirked. Let me guess. You found this check somewhere and thought today was your lucky day. For the first time, a faint shadow crossed Elijah's face. Not anger, disappointment, as though he had heard variations of the same assumption his entire life. The marble lobby fell silent again. Then Gregory did something that made several employees exchange alarmed glances. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver lighter. The flame flickered to life. Warm orange light danced across the surface of the check. A gasp escaped from somewhere behind the waiting area. Even the security guard near the entrance straightened. Elijah watched the tiny flame without moving, without speaking. And as the fire crept closer to the edge of the paper, nobody in the room realized they were seconds away from making the biggest mistake in the history of the bank. The tiny flame touched the corner of the check. A thin ribbon of smoke curled upward into the bright lobby air. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then Gregory lowered the lighter and watched the edge darken. The expression on his face carried the satisfaction of a man convinced he was proving a point. Around him, a few customers exchanged uncertain glances. Others stared openly. The young teller who had looked uncomfortable moments earlier shifted in her chair and swallowed hard. Something about the scene felt wrong. Elijah Brooks remained perfectly still. The orange reflection of the flame danced briefly across his eyes before disappearing. He did not reach for the check. He did not raise his voice. He simply watched. Gregory finally dropped the damaged paper onto the counter. There, he said. Now we can stop pretending. A nervous laugh came from somewhere in the waiting area. It faded almost. Immediately, Elijah lowered his gaze to the blackened edge of the document. Then he carefully picked it up between two fingers. The room expected anger. They expected outrage. Instead, he brushed a small trace of ash from his sleeve and asked a simple question. Are you finished? The calmness caught Gregory off guard. Only for a second. I think we are done here. Elijah nodded slowly. That is unfortunate. Sunlight streamed through the towering windows behind him, outlining his silhouette against the busy avenue outside. The city moved as it always did. Horns sounded in the distance. Pedestrians crossed intersections. Yet inside the bank, The atmosphere felt strangely suspended. Gregory pointed toward the entrance. "You can leave now." Elijah glanced around the lobby. His eyes passed over the marble columns, the customer service desks, the framed photographs hanging along the walls. He seemed to study everything with quiet attention, almost as if he had seen it all before. The observation lasted only a moment. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and removed a small leather notebook. Several employees noticed it. The notebook looked old, worn at the edges. Elijah opened it, wrote a few words, and closed it again. Gregory frowned. "What are you doing?" "Taking notes." "For what?" Elijah slipped the notebook back into his pocket. "For a report." Gregory laughed. "A report to who?" Elijah looked directly at him. "The people who need to read it." The answer irritated Gregory even more. Before he could respond, a woman waiting near the customer service desk leaned toward another customer and whispered, "Who is that man?" Nobody had an answer. That was the strange part. He looked ordinary. Yet the longer he stood there, the more difficult it became to ignore the quiet confidence surrounding him. Elijah adjusted the cuff of his jacket and turned toward the glass doors. As he walked away, several employees watched him leave. One teller noticed something unusual. The look on his face was not defeat. It was disappointment. Deep disappointment. As though he had come hoping to find something entirely different. Outside, the afternoon sun reflected across the banks. Giant silver logo mounted above the entrance. Elijah stopped on the sidewalk, reached for his phone, and dialed a number from memory. The call connected almost immediately. His voice remained calm. "This is Elijah Brooks," he said. "The evaluation is complete. Bring everyone." Inside the branch, Gregory Whitman felt better the moment the doors closed behind Elijah Brooks. The uncomfortable tension that had settled over the lobby seemed to lift. He straightened his tie, adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit, and returned behind the counter with the confidence of a man convinced he had protected his bank from a mistake. A few customers quietly resumed their conversations. Computer keyboards began clicking again. The normal sounds of business slowly returned. Gregory glanced toward the employees who had witnessed the confrontation. "That is exactly how you handle suspicious situations," he said. His voice carried through the lobby. Several workers nodded politely, though none looked particularly convinced. The young teller named Emily lowered her eyes and focused on her monitor. Something about the entire encounter continued to bother her. The man had never argued, never begged, never raised his voice. In Gregory's experience, people trying to deceive banks usually became emotional when challenged. Elijah had done the opposite. He had remained calm from beginning to end. Gregory pushed the thought away. He preferred certainty over doubt. Certainty had carried him through 23 years in banking. It had earned him promotions, bonuses, and a reputation for being tough. Across the lobby, a customer quietly approached Emily's station. "Who was that man?" the customer asked. Emily shook her head. "I do not know." Yet even as she answered, she found herself glancing toward the entrance. Outside, sunlight reflected across the glass facade of the building. The spot where Elijah had stood was now empty. Nearly 15 minutes passed. Gregory settled into his office overlooking the lobby. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the activity below. He opened his laptop and began reviewing quarterly performance reports. Numbers always calmed him. Numbers made sense. People did not. Then his desk phone rang. Gregory answered without looking up. Whitman speaking. The voice on the other end sounded nervous. "Sir, there is something unusual happening outside." Gregory frowned. "What kind of unusual?" "You should probably come see for yourself." Irritated, Gregory stood and walked toward the lobby windows. At first he saw nothing. Then a black SUV turned into the parking lot. Behind it came another, then another. Sleek vehicles rolled silently into position one after another. Employees began drifting toward the windows. Customers stopped mid-conversation. Even the security guard near the entrance stared outside. Gregory felt a small knot form in his stomach. More vehicles continued arriving. Expensive vehicles. Executive vehicles. The kind usually reserved for major corporate visits. The front doors opened as several sharply dressed men and women stepped out. Their tailored suits caught the afternoon sunlight. Their expressions were serious, focused, purposeful. Emily recognized one face immediately from company newsletters. Her eyes widened. "That cannot be," she whispered. Another employee turned pale. Gregory leaned closer to the glass. For the first time all day, Uncertainty crept into his thoughts. Because walking across the parking lot was not merely a regional executive. It was someone far above that. Someone who never visited branches without advance notice. And as the group moved toward the entrance with surprising urgency, Gregory suddenly remembered Elijah's final words. The evaluation is complete. Bring everyone. The lobby doors opened before anyone could say a word. Cool afternoon air swept across the marble floor as a group of executives entered with deliberate purpose. Their polished shoes echoed through the building. Conversations stopped. Keyboards fell silent. Even customers waiting in line turned to watch. Gregory Whitman immediately forced a smile onto his face. He straightened his posture and stepped forward. "Welcome to Whitmore National," he said confidently. "Had I known corporate leadership was visiting, I would have prepared accommodations." Nobody answered. That was the first thing Gregory noticed. Not a single executive slowed down. Not one returned his smile. Instead, they continued moving through the lobby as though they were searching for someone. Emily felt her pulse quicken. She recognized several faces now. Members of the executive board, senior legal counsel, the chief operating officer, people whose names appeared only in annual reports and shareholder meetings. They never visited branches without months of planning. Yet here they were, and they looked concerned. Gregory stepped into their path again. "Is there a problem?" he asked. The chief operating officer finally stopped. "Where is he?" Gregory blinked. "Who?" "Mr. Brooks." The answer landed like a stone in still water. Employees exchanged stunned looks. Gregory felt his stomach tighten. "You mean the man who was here earlier?" The executive's expression darkened immediately. "He was here." Several heads turned toward Gregory at once. The atmosphere changed. It became heavier, sharper. The chief legal officer pulled out a tablet and checked something on the screen. What exactly happened? Gregory suddenly became aware of dozens of eyes watching him. "Nothing serious," he said. "A customer presented a questionable check. I handled the situation." Nobody looked reassured. Outside the giant windows, sunlight flashed across a black sedan parked near the curb. A figure stepped from the vehicle. Emily noticed him first. Her breath caught. Elijah Brooks. He was returning. Yet something was different now. He walked with the same calm pace. The same worn jacket. The same work boots. But the executives inside immediately straightened the moment they saw him approaching. Gregory followed their gaze. Confusion spread across his face. The front doors opened again. Elijah entered quietly. No dramatic entrance. No announcement. Just a man walking through a bank lobby. Yet every executive present moved toward him at once. The chief operating officer reached him first. "Sir," he said respectfully. "We came as quickly as possible." The room froze. Gregory felt the color drain from his face. Emily covered her mouth. Customers stared openly. "Sir." The word echoed through the silence. Not Mr. Not customer. "Sir." Elijah. Nodded once. "Thank you for coming." Then his eyes moved across the lobby. Across the employees. Across the executives. Finally, they settled on Gregory Whitman. The branch manager suddenly felt very small standing beneath the bright lights of the building he thought he controlled. Elijah's expression remained calm. But there was something else in his eyes now. Not anger. Not revenge. The quiet disappointment of a man who had just confirmed exactly what he feared he would find. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The only sound inside the lobby was the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant traffic beyond the glass walls. Gregory Whitman stood frozen near the customer service desk. His confident posture had vanished. The executives who had entered moments earlier now formed a respectful circle around Elijah Brooks. Customers stared openly. Employees exchanged nervous glances. Emily could hardly believe what she was seeing. The same man who had been dismissed less than half an hour earlier was now being greeted with a level of respect she had never witnessed inside the branch. Elijah slowly removed his jacket and folded it over one arm. His movements remained calm and deliberate. Nothing about him suggested triumph. If anything, he looked tired. The chief operating officer stepped closer. "Sir, would you like us to move this discussion to a conference room?" Elijah shook his head. "No." His voice was quiet, but every person in the lobby heard it. "I think this conversation belongs right here." The executives nodded immediately. Gregory felt another knot tighten in his stomach. Elijah turned and looked around the branch again. His eyes lingered on the employees working behind the counters. Many lowered their gaze. Not because they feared him, Because they suddenly understood something important had happened. Something bigger than a routine customer complaint. Elijah finally looked at Gregory. How long have you managed this branch? Gregory swallowed. 7 years. And before that? Regional operations. Elijah nodded slowly. So you understand the culture this institution was built on. Gregory hesitated. Of course. The answer sounded far less certain than he intended. Elijah walked toward a framed photograph hanging on the wall. The picture showed the original headquarters building decades earlier. A much smaller structure than the modern bank surrounding them now. He studied it for a moment. Do you know what I see when I look at this photograph? Nobody answered. I see 12 people working in a rented office above a grocery store. Several executives smiled faintly. They had heard this story before. Elijah continued. I see employees who believed every customer deserved respect whether they carried $10 or $10 million. Silence settled over the lobby. Gregory's face became noticeably pale. The chief legal officer quietly handed Elijah a tablet. Elijah reviewed the screen for a moment. Then he looked back at Gregory. Do you know what concerns me most? Gregory said nothing. It is not the damage check. Elijah handed the tablet back. It is the fact that nobody verified anything before reaching a conclusion. The words landed harder than any accusation. Employees shifted uncomfortably. They remembered exactly what had happened. Assumptions had been made within seconds. Judgments had been formed immediately. Elijah's gaze moved through the room. A person's appearance should never determine the quality of service they receive. The branch felt smaller somehow. The bright marble floors, the polished counters, the expensive furniture. None of it seemed impressive anymore. Gregory opened his mouth as though searching for an explanation. None came. Because deep down, he already knew Elijah was right. And for the first time that afternoon, he began to understand that this was not simply an evaluation of a branch. It was an evaluation of the values that branch had forgotten. The lobby remained silent long after Elijah finished speaking. No one rushed to fill the emptiness. No one challenged his words. The sunlight that had flooded through the towering windows earlier now stretched across the marble floor in long golden bands, painting the room with the soft colors of late afternoon. Dust drifted through the light almost lazily, as though time itself had slowed down. Elijah stood near the photograph of the original headquarters building. For a moment he said nothing. His eyes remained fixed on the faded image. 12 people. One rented office. One dream. Decades earlier, he had stood in that cramped room surrounded by folding chairs, second-hand desks, and employees who believed that trust mattered more than appearances. Back then, every customer who walked through the door was greeted with respect because the bank had not yet forgotten why it existed. The memory lingered quietly behind his eyes. Around him, executives waited. Employees waited. Even customers seemed unwilling to move. Gregory Whitman lowered his gaze. The confidence that had defined him all afternoon had faded completely. He suddenly became aware of things he had ignored for years. The nervous expression on Emily's face. The uncomfortable silence from employees who had witnessed the incident. The way several customers now looked at him not with admiration, but disappointment. The realization settled heavily in his chest. Elijah finally turned away from the photograph. His voice, when it came, was softer than before. Do you know why I started visiting branches myself? Nobody answered. Because reports only show numbers. He slowly walked through the lobby. Numbers can tell you how much money enters a branch. They can tell you how many accounts were opened. They can tell you quarterly growth. His footsteps echoed gently across the polished floor. But numbers cannot tell you how people are treated. Several employees lowered their heads. Elijah stopped beside a customer waiting area. A little girl sat there holding her mother's hand. The same child who had witnessed everything earlier. She looked up at him curiously. Elijah smiled warmly. Hello. The girl smiled back. Simple. Natural. Without judgment. Elijah looked toward the adults surrounding her. Children notice things we stop seeing. His gaze shifted across the room. They notice kindness. They notice fairness. They notice respect. The words settled over the lobby like a quiet truth. Gregory felt each sentence more deeply than the last. Because he remembered the question the child had asked earlier. A question nobody had been able to answer. Elijah looked through the giant windows toward the city beyond. Cars moved through intersections. People hurried along sidewalks. Life continued. Every person who enters this building carries a story, he said quietly. Some stories are visible. Most are not. He turned back toward the employees. The moment we assume we know someone's worth before learning their story, we fail them. No one spoke. The silence was different now. It was no longer tension. It was reflection. And standing beneath the warm evening light, Gregory began to understand that the real evaluation had never been about a check, a transaction, or a policy. It had been about character. And character was much harder to measure. The silence lingered for several seconds after Elijah's last words. No one seemed willing to interrupt it. Then the chief operating officer stepped forward carrying a slim black folder. He opened it carefully and looked toward the gathering of employees. "There is something everyone here should understand," he said. His voice was calm, but it carried easily across the lobby. "Mr. Brooks did not come here today as a customer." A ripple of confusion moved through the room. Gregory looked up slowly. Emily frowned. Several customers exchanged puzzled glances. The executive continued. "For the past 18 months, a confidential review has been taking place across every branch in this institution." Elijah remained silent beside the windows. The golden light of the late afternoon reflected across the glass behind him. "The purpose was simple," the executive said, "to determine whether the values that built this bank still existed inside it." Gregory felt his pulse quicken. The chief legal officer stepped forward next. "Most people know the company as Whitmore National Bank. Few people know how it began." She looked toward Elijah. 32 years ago, one man mortgaged everything he owned, rented a small office above a grocery store, and opened a financial institution built on one principle. She paused. "Every person deserves dignity." The room became perfectly still. Elijah lowered his eyes briefly, almost uncomfortable hearing the story told. Aloud, the executive continued. "That man was Elijah Brooks." A collective gasp spread through the lobby. Several customers turned sharply toward him. Emily covered her mouth. Gregory stared as though the floor beneath him had vanished. Yet the revelation was not finished. The chief operating officer opened the folder again. "Mr. Brooks is not merely a shareholder." Another pause followed. "He is the founder of this bank." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The words seemed too large for the room itself. Gregory's face lost all color. He glanced toward the photograph hanging on the wall. The old headquarters building. The story Elijah had described. Suddenly, every detail made sense. The familiarity. The disappointment. The notebook. The evaluation. Elijah finally looked at the stunned faces surrounding him. "I stopped appearing in annual reports years ago," he said quietly. "I wanted the institution to become bigger than one person." His gaze moved across the employees. "But lately I began hearing stories." The warmth disappeared from his voice. Stories of people being judged before being served. Gregory lowered his eyes. Elijah continued. "So I started visiting branches myself." He slowly reached into his jacket and removed the damaged check. The blackened edge remained visible. "Not because I needed the money." He looked directly at Gregory. "Because I needed the truth." The lobby fell silent again. This time the silence felt different. It carried the weight of revelation, the weight of understanding. And standing beneath the fading sunlight, Gregory finally realized that the man he had dismissed as unimportant was the very reason the bank existed at all. No one in the lobby seemed capable of speaking after the truth was revealed. The late afternoon sun had dropped lower now, casting long shadows across the marble floor. The golden light reflected from the glass walls and wrapped the room in a quiet stillness that felt almost sacred. Elijah Brooks stood calmly near the center of the lobby. The damaged check remained in his hand. Around him, executives waited respectfully. Employees stood frozen behind their stations. Customers who had planned to leave hours earlier remained where they were, unable to walk away from what they had witnessed. Gregory Whitman stared at the floor. The realization had settled completely now. Every assumption he had made, every judgment, every word spoken with confidence, none of it could be undone. For the first time in many years, he did not know what to say. Eventually, he took a slow step forward. Then another. The branch manager who had once carried himself with certainty now looked like a man carrying a weight no one else could see. He stopped several feet from Elijah. The room watched. Gregory swallowed hard. "I was wrong." His voice barely rose above a whisper. Yet in the silence, everyone heard it. He lowered his eyes. "I judged you before I knew anything about you." No one interrupted. Elijah simply listened. Gregory continued. "I looked at your clothes. I looked at your appearance. And I convinced myself I understood your story. His voice trembled slightly. I did not. The confession seemed to drain years of pride from his shoulders. Elijah remained quiet for several seconds. Then he slowly folded the damaged check and placed it inside his jacket pocket. Do you know what disappoints me most? He asked gently. Gregory nodded faintly. Yes. Elijah studied him carefully. No. What disappoints me most is that I think you are capable of better. Gregory looked up, surprised. The answer was not what he expected. Elijah's voice remained calm. People make mistakes. Every person in this room has made them. His gaze moved briefly across the employees and customers surrounding them. The danger comes when mistakes become habits. The words settled heavily throughout the lobby. Gregory listened without moving. Elijah continued. You spent years learning banking, years learning policies, years learning procedures. He paused. But somewhere along the way, you forgot the simplest lesson. Gregory's eyes dropped again. Elijah pointed toward the entrance doors where customers entered every day. Every person who walks through those doors deserves dignity before they deserve evaluation. The room remained silent. Several employees blinked back emotion. Emily felt her throat tighten. She realized she would remember this moment for the rest of her life. Gregory finally looked directly at Elijah. I do not expect forgiveness. Elijah surprised him with a faint smile. Good. The answer confused everyone. Then Elijah added quietly, because forgiveness is not the goal. Gregory frowned. Elijah's expression softened. Growth is. The words hung in the warm evening air. Outside, the city continued moving beneath the fading sunlight. Inside the branch, however, something had changed. Not because a founder had been revealed, not because power had shifted, but because for the first time all day, pride had stepped aside and allowed humility to enter the room. The sun had nearly disappeared behind the skyline by the time the gathering finally began to break apart. The bright gold that had filled the lobby earlier had softened into a warm amber glow. Long shadows stretched across the marble floor. The executives quietly spoke among themselves. Customers slowly returned to their errands. Employees resumed their stations, though nothing felt quite the same as it had that morning. Elijah Brooks stood near the entrance for a moment, looking through the glass at the city beyond. The reflection staring back at him showed an older man now, more gray in his hair than he cared to admit, more years behind him than ahead. Yet there was peace in his eyes. The chief operating officer approached. The board is ready to implement every recommendation from the review. Elijah nodded. Good. And the branch? Elijah glanced back across the lobby. Gregory Whitman remained near the customer service desk. He had not tried to leave. He had not hidden in his office. Instead, he stood quietly speaking with employees one by one. Listening. Really listening. Elijah watched for several seconds before answering. Leave the final decision for another day. The executive looked surprised. Sir. Elijah smiled faintly. A person should be judged by what they do after a mistake, not only by the mistake itself. The executive nodded respectfully. Across the room, Emily noticed Elijah preparing to leave. She hurried forward. Mr. Brooks? Elijah turned. Yes. Emily hesitated. I just wanted to. Thank you. He looked genuinely confused. For what? Emily glanced around the lobby. For reminding us why this place exists. Elijah was silent for a moment. Then he smiled. Do not thank me. His eyes moved toward the entrance. Just remember it. Emily nodded. She would. Elijah stepped toward the doors. As he reached them, a small voice stopped him. Mr. Brooks. The little girl from earlier stood beside her mother. She looked up at him with curious eyes. Did everything turn out okay? Several people nearby paused to hear the answer. Elijah knelt slightly so he could meet her gaze. I think it did. The girl smiled. Good. Then she added, people should be nice before they know who someone is. A soft laugh moved through the room. Elijah smiled wider than he had all day. You are absolutely right. He stood again and gently pushed open the glass door. Cool evening air drifted inside. The city lights were beginning to appear across the streets and buildings beyond. Before stepping outside, Elijah looked back one final time. His eyes moved across the employees, the customers, the executives. Finally, they settled on the old photograph hanging on the wall. The picture of 12 people in a rented office above a grocery store. A dream built on dignity. A promise built on respect. For the first time in years, he felt confident that the promise still had a chance. Elijah stepped into the evening light and walked toward the sidewalk. Behind him, the doors closed softly. The lobby grew quiet. Not the silence of tension, not the silence of fear, the silence of understanding. And above the entrance, illuminated against the darkening sky, the bank's logo reflected in the glass, while the values that created it finally found their way home.